Well, there's a lot to talk about today, and I don't really know where to start, but I guess I want to kick off things with this interview that I heard this morning with Alan Dershowitz. And I thought he had a very sober assessment of what's going on. It very much lines up with how I feel. He was talking about the ongoing Trump legal battle, and he basically feels like at this point that there is merit to what the Trump campaign is doing, but he doesn't think it'll be enough ultimately in the courts for him to end up winning and becoming the president. And the way he would have to do that is by stalling enough in these few states, because there's no way that he's going to be able to win his lawsuits in time for these states to sort of change the vote counts and have it so that Trump ends up winning, and then those electoral votes go to Trump. He doesn't think that that's going to happen, and I would agree with that. I don't see how there's enough time for that. I mean, the legal fight doesn't seem like it's really started yet in earnest. This battle is nowhere near getting to the Supreme Court, which is where it will ultimately go and be decided. And so with that said, what Trump would have to do is get it so that there's a bone of contention about all these races in these different states, or in enough states to where it's not that Trump is able to win those electoral votes, but he's able to deny them from Joe Biden. And if Joe Biden loses enough states that way, even if they don't go to Trump, even if Joe Biden still has more electoral votes than Trump, if he doesn't get to 270, then he's not going to be elected president by the Electoral College. It'll have to go to the House. And that, as I've talked about many times before, would be a Trump win if the election is thrown to the House. But let's not talk about that, because to me, it doesn't matter in all this legal stuff necessarily if Trump wins or not. I mean, it matters, but that's not the biggest issue. To me, the biggest issue is that things were as shady and as opaque as they were. Even if, at the end of the day, they lose their legal battles, the way that this election was conducted, the way that mail-in ballots were just sent out to everyone willy-nilly, and that you had mail-in ballots littering the streets, and you had all this room for fraud, is a very bad thing. Something that should not go unpunished. Something that has to be dealt with before we have the 2022 midterms, let alone the 2024 presidential election. And so to me, it is imperative that Trump wins it in at least one of these states to prove the point that there was a certain level of cheating, and to make the case to ordinary Americans that the 2020 election was anything but free and fair. The narrative that this was the most secure election in American history, which even if you think that this election was not fraudulent, it is absurd to claim that this was, the most secure election in American history. It's like when, it's a Trump-level exaggeration. The media, over the past 4 years, has been so thoroughly destroyed by Trump that they've kind of turned into him, but a mirror image. And so when Trump says, this is the most fraudulent election in our history, even if that might be an exaggeration, and I'm not even sure necessarily that it is an exaggeration, the media is just going to reflexively say the exact same thing in just as an extreme of a way. But they want to be the polar opposite wherever he is. So when Trump takes an extreme position on something, the media is also going to take an extreme position. And unfortunately, their viewers are just going to lap it up. And so if we go through the next 4 years with, majority of Americans really thinking that this was a totally above board election, then there's nothing stopping these people in this handful of states from repeating the same sort of no good, that they've been up to in 2020. This is going to become, the new standard of just mailing out mail-in ballots randomly to everyone, of not verifying signature matches, of using these machines that may or may not be compromised, which, by the way, it is pretty fair to point out that the people who have historically had a problem with these electronic vote tabulation machines have been Democrats. For my entire life, Democrats have warned about the dangers, and I never thought that they were entirely wrong. It's why I'm glad that in my state we have paper backups of or paper ballots that are electronically counted that you can at least go back and audit later. Of course, if you don't audit it later, then there's really no point to that, which of course in all these states, even the Republican ones like Georgia, they're refusing to do that. And of course, as I've said, other than just trying to right the wrongs of this election to set the stage for 2024, even if Trump is unable to flip enough states to end up swinging the election in his, in his favor, or even if he doesn't win those states until later on, and so it doesn't end up making a difference, but in hindsight we know that Trump was cheated out of it. What it does is it totally cripples the Biden administration and turns Biden, and even more so Harris, into a lame duck president. Because, of course, Harris, nobody voted for her to be president anyway, so when Biden inevitably resigns and Harris becomes president, not only will she have never been elected president, but even the president who, she's replacing was not, fairly elected, which hopefully will lead to an entire lame duck term if they do end up, ultimately taking the White House. And on top of all this, the looming recession that I have been warning about for a long time, that the Fed has continued to postpone year after year. The recession which we should have had in 2008, which the Fed sort of blunted and kicked the can down the road, even though they weren't able to entirely stop a recession in 2008, nor did they try. That wasn't really their mission. They didn't want to completely stop the recession. They just wanted to give the economy a soft landing in classic Keynesian fashion. But, Jerome Powell over the last couple of years has kind of gone full MMT, and well beyond, your traditional hydraulic Keynesianism. And Jerome Powell is the one who ultimately saved, Donald Trump's rear end, from presiding over a real recession. I mean, we had this lockdown recession, but that was totally artificial. It was not a cyclical recession. It was not the end of a business cycle. It was, governments literally telling people that they cannot engage in economic activity. So, of course, on paper, you're going to have a recession. But people understand. People don't look at what happened this year as being akin to the 2008 recession, and they're not going to associate that with Trump in the same way that they associated, the 2008 crash with George W. Bush. And so if the Fed is unable to hold on in the next 4 years, which again, they had a tough time this time. People act like, people who I guess are Trump fans, act like that these last, 4 years have been rosy and everything has been perfect and things have just been trucking along and the economy's been so strong that, it's been quite the opposite from my perspective following this stuff every day. The economy has had a lot of close calls. And the only reason why our expansion, as anemic as it is, has continued is because the Fed has been relentless in propping up asset prices. They've propped them up to a much greater extent than just about anyone would have expected 4 years ago. And so the question is, can they continue to do that for another 4 years? Could the longest expansion in American history, as anemic as it is, last for another 4 years? Now, the answer might be yes, but if you've got a Democratic president who's going to hurt both consumer sentiment and small business sentiment, because that's just a natural thing. People associate Democrats with, relatively worse economies, and they associate Republicans with relatively better economies, psychologically, even if there's not much policy difference. And so you couple that with this proposed lockdown regime that is looking to shut down the economy and replace people's income with, money printed up by the Fed, something that I was warning about all year this year, saying when, if they tried to go this route with the lockdowns, that certainly would end our expansion. And as I've said, I think I've maintained this for quite a few months now, just in case anyone hasn't heard this. The way that our current expansion is going to end and the way that we're going to enter a real recession because the Fed has made it clear that they're not going to just let it happen, will be if the Fed loses control, i.e. if we get consumer price inflation. You can keep interest rates at 0% for as long as you want until the interest rate premium pushes, or I mean the inflation premium pushes interest rates up. And that's what's going to happen if you get consumer price inflation. Now, how do you get consumer price inflation? Well, you give consumers more money to spend. You put money in consumers' pockets that is not tied to production. You make it so that consumers are able to consume much more than they produce. And if they do that, if you have people just consuming everything and not producing anything, well, then prices have to go up because there's less stuff. People aren't making anything. They're just getting green pieces of paper shoved into their pockets by Uncle Sam. And so ironically, the MMT, basic minimum income, which will be spun as a way of trying to prevent a recession from occurring as a result of the lockdown, will be actually what ultimately ushers in the recession. And this, from my perspective, is a good thing. You want this to happen under a Democratic presidency, not so much so that people blame Democrats, but because the way that people think these days, even though these things are totally inaccurate, people associate Republicans with capitalism and laissez-faire, and they associate Democrats with Soviet socialism. Now, neither of these caricatures are anywhere close to reality. In fact, both parties basically represent fascism in an economic sense. Now, all of these supposed anti-fascists, the smarter ones probably would agree with what I just said, but your run-of-the-mill people on the streets who say that Donald Trump is a fascist probably have no idea what fascist economics actually looks like. But it's a close partnership between corporations, labor, and the government, all working together to further the goals of the state. That's pretty much what economic fascism is. And both parties believe in this. But if we have this massive welfare program, this MMT system, which is ushered in, which I was afraid Trump was going to bring into effect, and he might have if he was pushed hard enough. If this is brought into effect by a President Harris, let's say, a Democrat, and this leads to that economic calamity that I'm talking about, that would be a good thing, because then people will blame that on socialism. Even if that's not true, it will discredit, which again, what people call socialism isn't even that anyway. So, I mean, it's discrediting a bad idea either way. Whereas if this same calamity had occurred under Trump during his second term, people would be blaming that on laissez-faire and capitalism, even if it was the same policy that ultimately caused it. What matters is is whether you have a D or an R next to your name. That determines whether we blame the economic problems that occur during your term on capitalism or socialism. And ultimately, this is what I was hoping for in 2016 when I thought that Hillary was going to win. So again, that's why I'm trying to be very careful this time, and even now saying that I will. Oh, seems I had a bit of a blip in the recording there. I'm not exactly sure where you lost me. But I was talking about Hillary and how I thought that if she won, first of all, she wouldn't have cut taxes, so you wouldn't have had that kind of extension, that extra, wind at the backs of the American economy, and you also wouldn't have had the sentiment that Trump generated. And so I thought it would be, it was a pretty safe bet that if you had Hillary for 4 years, we would end up in a recession, and that'd be good because it would be blamed on her and not on Trump. I thought it would be pretty bad if Trump got into office and then we ended up in a recession. I did not want that to happen at all. Luckily, Trump got in and we did not end up in a recession. So, the best case scenario at this point, if Biden ends up pulling it out, is that, or pulling it off, excuse the innuendo there, what we want to see happen is have his win totally discredited in the courts by Trump and his legal team, that people regard him for the next 4 years, or Harris, as an illegitimate president, and that we end up in a recession partially, the result of their policies triggering it, but I mean that the recession is going to happen at some point anyway. It's, you have all that, you have all that bad debt built up in the system. It has to release at some point. It has to, it has to collapse the bubble that we're in. And so you have this essentially a lame duck president, an illegitimate president that gets us into a recession, and that sets up 2024 perfectly. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.